At the pharmacy counter, I handed over a $50 bill to cover the medicine of a terrified elderly man standing in front of me. He was trembling, defeated by a system that leaves old folks behind. As the cashier handed back my change, the frail man suddenly grabbed my forearm. His grip was shockingly tight. His eyes darted around nervously before he leaned in and whispered a warning that chilled me to the bone. He said, "After your son leaves, do not rake the leaves in your garden." I was confused, but I listened. The next morning, when I looked out into my yard, my knees nearly buckled at what I saw. If you are just discovering this story, take a deep breath, because what I am about to share is a nightmare I never thought possible in my own home, orchestrated by my own flesh and blood. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit the subscribe button if you have ever had to outsmart the very people who underestimated you. My name is Henry Stanton. I am 70 years old, a retired civil engineer, and I live a quiet life in suburban Ohio. For 40 years, my hands were calloused from gripping steel rebar and measuring the integrity of heavy structures. I spent my adult life building foundations that could withstand earthquakes, floods, and time. I thought I knew how to build a solid life, but nothing in my decades of engineering prepared me for the venomous cracks forming in the foundation of my own family. Since my wife passed away 3 years ago, I have lived alone in the house we built together. It is a large home surrounded by ancient oak trees that drop a mountain of dry leaves every autumn. Working in the yard kept my old hands busy and my mind off the empty chair at my dinner table. It was a brisk Tuesday afternoon when I drove my pickup truck down to the local pharmacy for my blood pressure medication. The bell above the door chimed as I walked in, shaking off the autumn chill. Ahead of me in line was an elderly man. He looked incredibly frail, wearing a worn gray coat that hung loosely off his stooped shoulders. He was nervously digging through a battered wallet, his spotted hands trembling violently, as the young cashier politely informed him that he was $42 short for his heart medication. I stood quietly and watched him. He looked terrified, desperately searching his empty pockets for single-dollar bills that simply were not there. I know what it feels like to be overlooked by the world when you get older, to feel like a burden. I stepped forward, pulled a $50 bill from my money clip, and placed it on the counter. I told the cashier to put the balance on my tab and keep the change. The old man slowly turned to look at me. His face was weathered, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. I fully expected a simple thank you. Instead, he stared at me with an intense, haunting desperation that instantly made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He reached out and gripped my forearm. For a man who looked like a strong breeze could knock him over his fingers, dug into my heavy flannel winter jacket with the terrifying strength of a drowning man holding onto his last lifeline. He leaned in very close, his breath rattling wetly in his weak lungs, and whispered those words directly into my ear. "After your son leaves, do not rake the leaves in your garden." I froze completely in place. The cashier was busy bagging the pill bottles, entirely oblivious to the strange interaction happening right in front of her. I stared down at the old man, my analytical mind racing to make any sense of what he had just said. How in the world did he know I even had a son? I had never seen this man before in my entire life. Our town is small, but not that small. And why would a complete stranger care about my backyard chores? I opened my mouth, demanding to know how he knew anything about my private family matters. But before I could even form the words in my dry throat, he snatched the pharmacy bag from the counter, released my aching arm, and practically bolted toward the exit doors. He moved with a frantic, paranoid energy, glancing nervously over his shoulder before pushing through the glass and disappearing into the cold afternoon gray. I stood there in stunned silence, taking my plastic bags from the cashier without saying another word. The drive back to my house felt like a disorienting blur. The heater in my truck was running full blast, but I absolutely could not shake the freezing feeling settling deep inside my chest. My son Brad is 38 years old. He is a commercial real estate developer, an aggressive businessman always chasing the next lucrative deal. He and his ambitious wife, Sarah, live in a modern luxury townhouse in the city, an hour away from my quiet street. They rarely visit me unless it is a major holiday obligation, or unless they desperately need something from me. The deeply unsettling fact that a terrified stranger at a random pharmacy was mentioning my son and my backyard in the very same breath felt like an impossible puzzle. As a civil engineer, my brain is fundamentally wired to find pure logic. But there was no logic here. There was just a creeping, dark intuition slowly wrapping around my heart, telling me that something was terribly wrong. I turned the final corner onto my street, my heavy tires crunching over fallen leaves. As my familiar house came into view at the end of the cul-de-sac, my lingering confusion instantly morphed into a sharp, heavy rock in my stomach. Parked right in the center of my driveway was a sleek, impeccably clean black Mercedes SUV. Brad's car. My resting pulse quickened immediately. Brad never visited me on a random Tuesday afternoon, and he certainly never came all the way out to the suburbs completely unannounced. I pulled my truck up, slowly cutting the engine and sitting in the sudden silence of the cabin. Through the dusty windshield, I saw them clearly. Brad and Sarah were standing together on my elevated front porch. They were not looking toward the driveway to greet me as a loving family normally would. Instead, they were standing near the wooden railing, completely engrossed in looking out toward my sprawling, leaf-covered backyard. Brad was pointing aggressively at the ground, tracing an invisible, calculated line across the property, with his index finger, as if he were zoning a new construction lot. Sarah was standing close beside him, holding a thick stack of glossy brochures in her manicured hands. But it was the distinct expression on their faces that made my seasoned blood run completely cold. They were smiling, not the warm, affectionate smiles of a busy son and daughter-in-law taking time to visit their aging, widowed father. It was a cold, calculated, and distinctly predatory smile. It was the exact same greedy look an opportunistic contractor gets before they tear down an old, vulnerable building to make way for a highly profitable concrete high-rise. I sat frozen in the silent cab of my truck, my hands gripping the steering wheel as the mysterious old man's desperate warning echoed loudly in my mind. "After your son leaves, do not rake the leaves in your garden." I took a long, deep breath, steeling my old nerves, and pushed the heavy truck door open to face whatever dark storm my own flesh and blood had just brought to my doorstep. I slammed the truck door shut. Walking up my driveway felt like crossing into enemy territory. Brad and Sarah turned their predatory smiles melting into masks of warmth. Brad stepped forward, clapping my shoulder with rehearsed enthusiasm. He claimed it was a spontaneous visit to treat me to dinner. I knew my son. Brad never did anything spontaneously. Every move was a calculated investment. I unlocked the door and welcomed them inside. The air immediately felt dense, thick, with an unspoken agenda. I went to the kitchen to heat up the dinner I had prepared while they settled at the table. As I carried the plates out, I studied them. My structural engineering background always made me look for stress points in every foundation. Looking at my son and his wife, I saw a fragile facade. Brad wore a tailored suit that cost more than my first car. A gold watch gleamed on his wrist. Sarah was draped in designer silk, her fingers adorned with diamonds. I set the warm plates down, my mind drifting to how Brad was raised. My late wife and I worked tirelessly to give him a grounded, honest childhood. We saved for years to put him through college, driving old cars and eating modest meals so he could focus without student loans. We taught him the value of $1. We believed we raised a man of integrity. Yet sitting across from me now, slicing into his beef with arrogance, he looked like a stranger. He looked like a man who worshipped money above all else. We ate in silence for a few minutes. The sharp clinking of silverware against porcelain was the only sound. Then Brad cleared his throat loudly, sharing a knowing glance with Sarah. He reached into the expensive briefcase he brought and pulled out a stack of glossy brochures. He slid them deliberately across the polished wood toward me. The bold lettering on the top brochure read, "Whispering Pines Luxury Assisted Living." I stared down at the pamphlets, feeling a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Brad leaned forward, adopting a tone of patronizing concern. He said he and Sarah had been talking lately about my living situation. He pointed out this house was simply too large for one person to maintain, especially a man my age. He claimed they worried constantly about my safety if a medical emergency happened. He excitedly said Whispering Pines had a golf course medical staff on call and a vibrant community. He framed the concept as a permanent vacation, a reward for a lifetime of grueling labor. Sarah reached out gracefully and placed her perfectly manicured hand gently over mine. Her skin felt unnaturally cold against my warm knuckles. She tilted her head slightly, her face projecting a picture of manufactured, sickly, sweet sympathy. She softly said they just wanted what was absolutely best for me. Then she looked me directly in the eyes and delivered a line that made the warm blood freeze completely solid in my veins. "You should not be out there raking leaves at your age, Dad. It is incredibly dangerous. You could easily slip and fall, and absolutely no one would even know." The quiet words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Raking leaves. My sharp mind instantly snapped back to the terrified, shaking old man at the busy pharmacy counter. His desperate, crushing grip on my arm. His raspy voice begging me not to rake the leaves in my garden after my son leaves. It was a completely impossible coincidence. Sarah could have easily mentioned shoveling snow, or cleaning the high gutters, or fixing the roof, but she specifically, intentionally chose the leaves. The exact same obscure detail the frightened stranger had frantically warned me about just a few hours ago. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but my 4 decades of managing extremely high-pressure construction disputes kept my face perfectly still. I absolutely did not let a single ounce of my internal panic show on my exterior. I slowly, deliberately pulled my hand away from beneath Sarah's cold palm. I calmly picked up the stack of glossy brochures, tapped them neatly against the table, and slid them right back across the dining surface, directly to Brad. I kept my deep voice incredibly calm, perfectly measured, and completely devoid of visible emotion. I politely told them I truly appreciated their deep concern, but I was perfectly fine living right where I was. I strongly reminded them both that I personally built this solid house with my own 2 hands, and I had absolutely no intention of leaving it. I confidently stated my health was excellent, my mind was perfectly sharp, and I genuinely enjoyed physically maintaining my own private property. I told them the subject was firmly and permanently closed. Brad's square jaw tightened instantly. The warm, affectionate mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing a quick flash of intense, burning frustration. He opened his mouth to fiercely argue, to push his agenda much harder, but Sarah quickly kicked him forcefully beneath the wooden table. I clearly saw the sudden, slight shift in her stiff posture. She gave him a sharp, dark, warning look, silently signaling him to back down immediately. Brad swallowed hard, rapidly, forcing the fake, pleasant smile right back onto his tense face. He smoothly said they understood completely, that they just wanted me to surely know the luxurious option was always there if I ever changed my stubborn mind. The remaining duration of the dinner was agonizingly awkward. The casual conversation dried up completely rapidly, replaced by a suffocating, heavy tension that quickly filled every single corner of the quiet dining room. As soon as the meal was officially over, they were suddenly in a massive rush to leave my home. The spontaneous visit concluded when the pitch failed. I stood up to clear the dishes, carrying the plates toward the sink. As I turned my back on them, I glanced at the reflective surface of the microwave. In the distorted reflection, I saw Brad frantically typing on his phone. His thumbs flew across the screen with desperate urgency, his face pale and sweating. He was not just sending a text message. He was issuing a frantic warning to someone. I turned the cold water on, letting the rushing noise fully mask my sudden movements. I leaned forward over the stainless steel sink and looked out the window into my expansive backyard. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the lawn. The autumn wind blew gently, slightly shifting the thick blanket of unraked brown and orange leaves that covered the ground. But as my eyes scanned the perimeter of my property, my breath caught and hitched in my throat. Cutting directly through the grass leading straight from the back gate toward the largest pile of fallen leaves were deep tire tracks. Massive, heavy vehicle treads pressed firmly and deeply into the damp, soft soil. Those exact tracks had simply not been there this early morning when I left for the pharmacy. Someone had definitely been illegally trespassing in my private backyard today without permission. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I sat in the worn leather armchair by the living room window, sipping cold black coffee and watching the moonlight cast long, deceptive shadows across the unraked leaves in my backyard. My mind, trained for decades to calculate load-bearing weights and structural stress, was desperately trying to calculate the weight of my own son's deception. The tire tracks carved into my grass were an undeniable anomaly. They were a glaring error in the quiet equation of my retirement. As dawn finally broke, painting the suburban Ohio sky in pale shades of gray, I heard the heavy floorboards creak above me. Brad and Sarah were awake. I remained perfectly still in my chair, listening to the muffled sounds of their morning routine. I heard the sharp click of Sarah's designer heels on the hardwood, followed by the deep timbre of Brad's voice as he talked on his cell phone. I could not make out the exact words, but the tone was hushed, urgent, and strictly business. At exactly 7 in the morning, they descended the staircase. I forced my stiff muscles to relax, painting on a mask of weary, oblivious old age. Brad walked into the kitchen, dressed in another pristine suit, casually tossing his empty disposable coffee cup into the stainless steel trash can by the counter. He smiled warmly, telling me he had a busy day at his real estate development firm, but that he would check on me later. Sarah gave me another one of those sickeningly sweet, entirely fake smiles, reminding me to seriously consider the Whispering Pines brochures. I nodded slowly, offering a tired, agreeable wave as they walked out the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them. I waited precisely 5 minutes. I watched from the window as Brad's black SUV backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the quiet street. Once the coast was completely clear, I let out a long, heavy breath. The charade was absolutely exhausting. I stood up and walked into the kitchen. My eyes fell immediately on the trash can where Brad had discarded his coffee cup. A lingering instinct, a sharp whisper of suspicion, nudged me forward. I stepped over to the bin and pulled the plastic lid back. Inside, resting on top of yesterday's newspaper, was Brad's crumpled paper cup. But it was not completely empty. Stuffed hastily inside the cardboard sleeve was a tightly folded, crumpled piece of thick paper. I reached in and pulled it out. My calloused fingers instantly recognized the distinct heavy texture. It was high-grade architectural drafting paper. My heart began to pound, a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs, as I carried the crumpled wad over to the smooth granite island. I carefully smoothed the heavy paper out flat under the bright kitchen lights. I grabbed my reading glasses from the counter and slipped them on. For 40 years, I had analyzed complex blueprints, city grids, and topological surveys. I could read a schematic the way most men read the morning news. What lay before me was not a general zoning map. It was a highly detailed, incredibly precise topographical scan, and the boundaries drawn on the page were intimately familiar. I traced the black ink lines with my index finger, my breath catching in my throat. It was my property. It was an exact professional rendering of my house, my driveway, and my sprawling backyard. The scan was heavily annotated with red ink. Someone had taken meticulous measurements of the soil density and elevation drops. But what truly made the blood freeze in my veins were the 3 large red X marks drawn directly over the deepest pile of unraked autumn leaves near the back fence. Next to those harsh red marks, written in Brad's distinct, aggressive handwriting, were 2 words: excavation target. The profound grief I had carried since my wife passed away evaporated in that very second. It did not turn into sadness. It turned into solid, impenetrable ice. An excavation target in my own backyard. A survey done entirely without my permission. The heavy machinery tracks I had seen last night suddenly made terrifying sense. Someone was coming to dig up my property. I stared blindly at the red ink, my mind rapidly piecing together the fragmented timeline of the past year. 6 months ago, Brad had been drowning in severe financial trouble. His commercial development firm was hemorrhaging money, facing lawsuits, and drowning in massive debt. He had come begging for a loan, desperate and sweating. I had refused to give him a blank check, offering instead to help him restructure his business plan. He had been furious. But then, almost overnight, his severe financial problems vanished. Out of nowhere, he suddenly paid off every single debt. He bought the luxury townhouse, the expensive suits, and the pristine SUV. He claimed he had landed a massive, highly confidential investor. Right around that exact same time, his sudden, overwhelming concern for my mortality began. 6 months ago, he started aggressively insisting that I update my will. He brought lawyers to my house, pushing me to sign documents that granted him full power of attorney over my estate, claiming it was just standard preparation for the future. He wanted absolute, unrestricted control over this specific piece of land. I stood perfectly still in the silent kitchen, staring down at the blueprint that proved my own flesh and blood viewed me not as a father, but as a temporary obstacle standing on top of a highly valuable secret. Brad did not want to put me in an assisted living facility because he cared about my failing health. He wanted me out of the way so he could completely tear up my backyard without any interference. The terrifying question was no longer what they were doing. The question was what exactly was buried beneath the unraked leaves in my garden that was worth destroying our family to retrieve. My intense train of thought was violently shattered by the shrill, sudden ringing of the landline phone mounted on the kitchen wall. The sound made me jump, my heart hammering violently against my chest. I stared at the ringing phone for a long moment, my hands shaking slightly. I took a deep breath, composed myself, and lifted the heavy receiver to my ear. I answered with a cautious, quiet hello. The voice on the other end of the line was panicked, breathless, and frantic. It was the familiar voice of the local pharmacy manager. He asked if I was the man who had generously paid for the elderly gentleman's heart medication yesterday afternoon. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, and I slowly confirmed that I was indeed that man. The manager's voice cracked with raw, unhidden fear as he spoke his next words. He said the police had just arrived at the plaza. He told me that Mr. Caldwell, the frail old man I had helped, had just been found in the narrow alley behind the pharmacy. He had been brutally and severely beaten, left clinging to life in a pool of his own blood. I dropped the heavy plastic phone. It clattered loudly against the granite countertop, but I did not stop to pick it back up. I grabbed my house keys from the hook and sprinted to my truck with an agility I had not felt in years. The drive to the county hospital was a blur of flashing traffic lights and squealing tires. My mind, usually a disciplined engine of logic and structure, was spinning wildly out of control. For 40 years, I calculated the breaking points of steel, but I had no formula for this. A frail man I met for exactly 2 minutes was now fighting for his life, in a hospital bed, brutally beaten, because he dared to warn me about my own son. When I slammed the truck into park near the emergency room entrance, the night air hit my face like a blow. I pushed through the sliding glass doors into the harsh, sterile lights of the waiting area. A bored security guard stood near the triage desk, asking for identification and patient relation. I did not have time for pointless bureaucracy. I straightened my posture, channeling the commanding authority I used to wield on massive construction sites, and told the guard with unwavering confidence that I was Arthur Caldwell's older brother. I demanded to see him immediately. The guard hesitated, clearly intimidated by my intense tone, and pointed me toward the intensive care unit on the 3rd floor. I did not wait. I moved past him rapidly, my boots hitting the floor with heavy, determined thuds. The intensive care unit was a bleak maze of quiet corridors and softly beeping medical machines. The strong smell of antiseptic and rubbing alcohol burned my nostrils as I navigated the winding hallways. I found his private room at the very end of the hall. Peering cautiously through the small glass window in the door, my heart sank deeply into my chest. Mr. Caldwell looked impossibly small in the center of the large hospital bed. His face was a tragic canvas of deep purple, black, and yellow bruises. Clear plastic tubes and thick wires extended from his arms and chest, tethering him to a massive wall of monitors that pulsed with a fragile, erratic rhythm. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped silently into the dim room. The mechanical hissing of the life support ventilator was the only sound, breaking the heavy silence. I stood perfectly still beside his bed, looking down at his battered, fragile hands. They were the exact same spotted hands that had gripped my arm so fiercely just yesterday afternoon. A massive wave of profound guilt and burning anger washed over my entire body. This elderly man was completely innocent. He was tragic collateral damage in a dark game being played in my own backyard. I leaned in very close, softly speaking his name, desperately hoping my familiar voice would somehow reach him through the heavy fog of severe physical trauma and potent pain medication. For a long, agonizing moment, there was absolutely no response. Then slowly, his swollen eyelids fluttered. His bloodshot eyes drifted aimlessly around the sterile room before finally locking onto my face. A sudden weak jolt of recognition sparked in his dull gaze. He tried to lift his heavy head from the pillow, but his remaining strength was entirely gone. I gently placed my hand over his, quietly urging him to stay completely still. His chest heaved with a wet, ragged breath, fiercely fighting the mechanical rhythm of the loud ventilator. He gripped my fingers weakly. His dry lips parted and he forced the crucial words out with agonizing, visible effort. He gasped, his voice barely a broken, strained whisper saying, "Brad's partners. They needed a clean name. The soil." He choked violently, a harsh cough rattling his fragile frame. He squeezed my hand one last time, his eyes wide with a desperate, lingering terror. He tried to speak again, to bravely finish the warning, but his body simply gave out. The monitors beside his bed instantly erupted into a deafening, high-pitched alarm. The steady green line tracking his heart rate dropped into a jagged spike before flattening out completely into a solid, unbroken red line. The heavy door flew open behind me. A dedicated team of doctors and nurses rushed frantically into the tight space, shouting medical codes and pushing me aggressively away from the bed. I stumbled backward into the bright hallway as they quickly closed the privacy blinds, leaving me standing alone with the echoing sound of the flatline alarm. I walked out of the hospital feeling entirely hollow, yet my mind was moving with absolute terrifying clarity. The cold night wind whipped fiercely against my jacket as I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. Brad's partners. A clean name. The soil. The fragmented pieces of the dark puzzle aggressively snapped into perfect place. My son's commercial real estate development firm was not a legitimate business. It was a carefully constructed front. I vividly recalled the desperate financial trouble he was in 6 months ago, followed immediately by his sudden, miraculous recovery. He had knowingly partnered with a violent criminal syndicate. They were laundering dirty money through massive construction projects, and they desperately needed a spotless, highly respectable front to safely anchor their entire illegal operation. They explicitly needed the pristine name of a retired, decorated civil engineer with 4 decades of unblemished civic service. They needed my name. A sickening, vivid memory flashed sharply behind my eyes. 2 weeks ago, Brad had visited my home with a thick stack of manila folders. He smoothly claimed they were harmless routine tax forms directly related to my late wife's remaining estate. He had seemed so incredibly impatient, hovering anxiously over my shoulder, pointing exactly where I needed to sign. I had blindly trusted my own son. I had signed the extensive papers without reading the dense fine print. I unwittingly signed away the legal rights to my property and practically painted a giant target on my back. I drove back to my quiet neighborhood in absolute silence. The truck radio turned off, my mind actively plotting every structural weakness in my son's arrogant plan. He truly thought he could use me as a human shield, a disposable asset, to protect himself from his violent partners. He thought I was just a tired old man, waiting quietly to die in an assisted living facility. I pulled slowly into my dark driveway, the deep shadows of the familiar cul-de-sac offering absolutely no comfort tonight. I walked up the concrete steps to my front porch, reaching into my thick coat pocket for my brass house keys. But as my hand grasped the cold metal doorknob, my blood instantly turned to solid ice. The heavy oak door was already unlocked. The secure deadbolt had been completely disengaged. I pushed the door open silently, stepping cautiously into the pitch-black foyer. I held my breath, listening intently to the deafening silence of my empty home. Then I heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps were pressing down hard on the wooden floorboards, directly above my head. The methodical creaking moved precisely down the upstairs hallway, advancing toward the closed door of my private home office. The heavy footsteps creaked directly above my head, moving with a hurried, unnatural weight toward the closed door of my private home office. I stood frozen in the dark foyer, my heart hammering a violent rhythm against my ribs. My own son was creeping through my empty house like a common thief in the night. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to storm up that wooden staircase, kick the office door open, and demand to know exactly what he was doing. I wanted to grab him by the lapels of his expensive tailored suit and shake the absolute truth out of him. I wanted to ask him why a kind, innocent old man at the local pharmacy was currently fighting for his very life in an intensive care unit just because he had tried to warn me. But I forced my burning anger down. I locked it away behind a mental wall of cold, calculated steel. For 40 years as a civil engineer, I had managed incredibly volatile construction sites. I knew intimately that acting entirely on raw emotion during a critical structural failure only leads to complete catastrophic collapse. Patience was not just a virtue in my profession. Patience was an absolute necessity for sheer survival. I needed to stop Brad immediately, but I could not let him know that I was already aware of his dark, tangled web of lies. I needed to play a highly specific part. I looked down at the small entryway table beside me. Resting near the edge was a heavy ceramic vase that my late wife had purchased during a long-ago trip to the coast. I took a deep, steadying breath, reached out my calloused hand, and deliberately pushed the heavy ceramic vase straight off the edge of the wooden table. It hit the hardwood floor with a deafening, explosive shatter that echoed loudly through the silent house. The rapid footsteps above me stopped instantly. A thick, suffocating silence fell over the entire house. I let out a loud, dramatic groan, deliberately shuffling my boots against the floorboards, and called out into the dark. I asked if anyone was up there, my voice expertly laced with the shaky, uncertain tremor of a frightened, confused old man. For a few agonizing seconds, there was absolutely no response. Then the office door clicked open. The stairs groaned under a slow, hesitant weight. Brad cautiously descended into the dim light of the foyer. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed and pale at the exact same time. His necktie was loosened, and a fine sheen of nervous sweat covered his forehead. He jumped slightly when he saw me standing amidst the broken ceramic shards. He frantically tried to construct a believable lie, stammering that he had not expected me home so soon. He smoothly claimed that he had accidentally left a very important, expensive fountain pen in my home office during his visit earlier today, and had just stopped by to quickly retrieve it. He held up empty hands, offering a weak, unconvincing chuckle, stating that he must have left the pen at his own office after all. I looked directly into his lying eyes. The overwhelming urge to grab him by his collar and throw him against the wall was nearly blinding. I remembered the hours I spent teaching him how to ride a bicycle on this very street. I remembered paying for his college tuition. Now he was treating me like a foolish obstacle. But my physical restraint held firm. I channeled the intense, disciplined focus I used when designing suspension bridges. I knew that letting a single crack show in my structural facade would compromise my entire foundation. I did not challenge his absurd story about the missing pen. Instead, I let my broad shoulders slump forward in deep, exaggerated defeat. I rubbed my eyes wearily with the back of my hand, forcing a heavy, authentic-sounding sigh to escape my dry lips. I looked at the broken pieces of my late wife's beloved ceramic vase scattered across the floor, then looked back up at my son. I told him with a voice full of manufactured sorrow and quiet resignation that I was simply getting too old and clumsy to manage this massive house all by myself. I let the silence hang for a moment before delivering the exact bait I knew he desperately wanted to swallow. I softly told Brad that perhaps he and Sarah were completely right. I told him that maybe I really should look at that luxury nursing home they had suggested. The physical transformation in Brad was immediate and entirely sickening. The sharp, panicked tension completely vanished from his shoulders. The tight, nervous lines around his mouth relaxed into a broad, victorious smile. He genuinely believed that he had finally broken my spirit. He stepped forward and placed a warm, comforting hand on my shoulder, playing the role of the deeply concerned, loving son to absolute perfection. He gently told me that it was a very smart decision and that he would personally handle all the complicated paperwork so I would not have to worry about a single thing. He promised to call me tomorrow to finalize the details. With his immediate goal seemingly accomplished, Brad quickly excused himself, practically jogging out the front door and into the cold autumn night. I stood silently in the dark foyer, listening intently as his heavy vehicle backed out of the driveway and sped rapidly down the street. The very second the faint sound of his engine completely faded into the distance, my weary, defeated posture vanished. I stood up perfectly straight, my mind shifting instantly from a vulnerable old man back to a calculating engineer. I did not bother sweeping up the broken ceramic shards. I immediately turned and walked briskly up the wooden staircase, taking the steps two at a time. I entered my private home office and flipped on the bright overhead lights. I stood in the center of the quiet room, my sharp eyes scanning every single detail. I checked my filing cabinets, my desk drawers, and my personal safe. Nothing was missing. Every financial document, every family photo, and every personal record remained completely untouched in its proper place. My son did not come here tonight to steal anything from me. He had come here to intentionally plant something. I slowly walked the perimeter of the room, looking for any structural inconsistencies. As I approached the far corner, I noticed it. My heavy, solid oak bookshelf, which had sat flush against the wall for over 20 years, was slightly misaligned. The edge was jutting out perhaps a quarter of an inch, leaving a thin, dark shadow against the baseboard. I firmly gripped the thick wooden edge and pulled the heavy bookshelf away from the wall. I took a deep, steadying breath and looked at the floor. Tucked securely in the hidden narrow space behind the shelving unit, resting silently on the hardwood floor, was a thick, industrial-grade metal briefcase tightly secured with dual combination locks. I stared down at the heavy metal briefcase, my mind racing through the countless possibilities of what could possibly be locked inside. The thick steel casing and the complex dual combination dials suggested something of immense value, or perhaps something incredibly dangerous. Every fiber of my being wanted to grab a heavy crowbar from my garage workbench and smash the locks right off. I wanted to pry the secrets out into the bright light of my home office, but my decades of civil engineering experience immediately warned me against acting on raw impulse. If I broke the locks, Brad would instantly know that his dark deception had been completely exposed. He would aggressively pivot, shift his illicit operations, and likely move to declare me legally incompetent before I could ever gather solid, undeniable proof of his crimes. I needed to trap him entirely unaware. I needed to catch him in the act. I carefully pushed the heavy metal briefcase back into the dark, narrow void behind the shelving unit. I gripped the thick wooden edge of the oak bookshelf and slowly slid it back into its exact original position, ensuring the alignment was completely perfect. I wiped away the faint scuff marks on the hardwood floor with the soft sleeve of my flannel shirt, erasing any trace of my presence. The trap needed to remain entirely undisturbed. I walked out of the house and climbed into my reliable pickup truck. I intentionally avoided the local hardware stores in my immediate neighborhood, knowing perfectly well that the clerks recognized my face and might mention my purchases to anyone asking questions. Instead, I drove 45 minutes down the interstate to a large remote hunting supply store located 2 towns over. The cavernous store smelled strongly of leather canvas and gun oil. I walked directly to the outdoor surveillance aisle and meticulously selected 4 military-grade motion-activated trail cameras. I made absolutely sure to choose models equipped with invisible, infrared, night vision, high-capacity memory cards, and cellular transmission capabilities that could quietly send live video feeds directly to my private mobile phone. As I placed the expensive equipment on the checkout counter, the young cashier asked if I was tracking a particularly elusive buck this season. I offered him a tired, warm smile, playing the role of a harmless old hunter perfectly. I simply told him that I was trying to catch a highly destructive predator that kept coming into my property under the thick cover of darkness. I paid with cash to avoid leaving any digital paper trail, grabbed the heavy shopping bags, and drove back to my quiet suburban street as the cold autumn sun began to sink below the horizon. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky was a bruised shade of deep purple and charcoal black. I grabbed the shopping bags and headed straight for the backyard. The biting autumn wind whipped fiercely through the bare branches, rattling the thick canopy of ancient oak trees that surrounded my property line. I unpacked the sleek camouflage-painted cameras and strapped the heavy utility belt around my waist. Looking up at the towering massive oak tree nearest to the unraked pile of leaves, a sudden wave of sharp physical pain shot through my lower back. I am 70 years old, and my joints fiercely protested the very idea of vertical exertion. But as I firmly grasped the lowest, thickest branch and hoisted my heavy body upward, an old familiar instinct rapidly took over. Long before I was a civil engineer, I was a young infantryman serving in the military. My body automatically remembered the rigorous combat training, the strict discipline of moving silently through hostile territory, and the sheer willpower required to ignore physical agony. I climbed higher into the dark canopy, the rough bark scraping painfully against my calloused hands. As I reached the optimal vantage point, a sudden, profoundly painful memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. I remembered being 30 years younger, standing in this exact same massive oak tree on a bright, sunny Saturday afternoon. I remembered reaching my strong hand down to pull a laughing, gap-toothed little boy up onto the sturdy branches. I had spent hours patiently teaching a young Brad how to find the safest footholds, how to properly balance his shifting weight, and how to conquer his fear of heights. I had looked at my innocent, joyful son with such immense, overwhelming pride. Now, decades later, I was hanging in the freezing darkness of those very same branches, meticulously installing covert surveillance equipment to capture that exact same boy committing severe federal crimes. The heartbreaking contrast between the innocent child I raised and the treacherous monster he had become nearly suffocated me. I swallowed the bitter, heavy grief and focused entirely on the grim mission at hand. I secured the first trail camera tightly against the thick trunk, aiming the invisible infrared lens precisely at the massive pile of unraked leaves where Brad and Sarah had been pointing earlier that day. I activated the cellular transmission, verifying the crisp, clear night vision feed on my glowing phone screen. I moved silently from tree to tree, enduring the burning aches in my knees, my tight hips, and my weary shoulders, until all 4 cameras were perfectly positioned to capture every possible angle of the targeted excavation site. The entire backyard was now a highly monitored, inescapable net. I finally climbed down the last tree, my heavy boots hitting the soft, damp grass with a quiet, solid thud. I brushed the loose brown dirt from my heavy winter jacket, feeling a grim, dark sense of final accomplishment. The trap was finally set. I turned my tired body to walk back toward the inviting warmth of my house, intending to finally rest my exhausted, aching muscles. But as I took my very first step toward the back patio, a sudden blinding flash of bright light violently shattered the peaceful darkness of the quiet neighborhood. The powerful motion sensor floodlight mounted directly above my front driveway had just been abruptly triggered. I froze completely, my heart instantly leaping into my dry throat. The sudden brilliant illumination cast long, sharp, terrifying shadows across the side of my brick house. I crept silently along the wall, staying completely hidden in the dark edge of the yard, and peered cautiously around the sharp corner toward the brightly lit driveway. A massive jet-black SUV with heavily tinted windows was slowly, almost silently rolling to a complete stop directly in front of my property. It was not Brad's familiar vehicle. This truck was entirely unmarked, aggressively large, and distinctly menacing in the harsh artificial light. The heavy engine hummed with a low, dangerous, guttural vibration that seemed to shake the cold ground beneath my boots. I stood completely paralyzed in the freezing autumn shadows, my breath pluming quietly in the cold air, watching the terrifyingly unfamiliar vehicle idle aggressively just inches from my front lawn. I tightly gripped the rough edge of the brick wall, realizing the dangerous storm had arrived at my doorstep much faster than I had ever anticipated. I pressed my spine against the freezing brick exterior of my home. The heavy rumbling of the black SUV vibrated through the soil and traveled up through the soles of my boots. I knew I could not stay exposed in the side yard. If that powerful motion sensor light caught a fraction of my shadow, the delicate trap I had just spent hours building in the trees would be destroyed. I moved with agonizing slowness, sliding my boots across the damp grass. I placed every single step with absolute precision to avoid snapping a stray twig. I slipped silently through the heavy wooden gate, pulling it shut with care, and eased the back door open. I slid inside, pulling the oak door shut until the deadbolt clicked into place. I stood frozen in the dark kitchen, my chest heaving desperately, trying to quiet the harsh sound of my rapid breathing. I moved stealthily into the living room, relying on memory to navigate the dark space. I crouched low behind the heavy velvet drapes that framed the front bay window. I parted the dusty fabric just a fraction of an inch, creating a perfectly concealed line of sight straight to the driveway. The security floodlight blazed brightly, cutting through the cold darkness and illuminating the massive vehicle idling just beyond my brick mailbox. The heavy passenger doors of the massive SUV swung open simultaneously with a synchronized click. Two men stepped out into the crisp night air, and my sharp instincts instantly categorized them as imminent threats. They absolutely did not look like friendly real estate developers, and they certainly did not look like city zoning officials surveying a quiet neighborhood. They were dressed in sharp, highly expensive dark suits that seemed jarringly out of place in my peaceful suburban cul-de-sac. They moved with a rigid, calculated efficiency that immediately sent a chilling warning straight down my spine. The taller man casually adjusted his tailored jacket, his cold eyes methodically scanning the quiet perimeter of my property with complete professional detachment. The second man, who was shorter and heavily built, pulled a sleek digital camera from his inner coat pocket. He began snapping rapid, systematic photographs of my front yard, carefully documenting the specific angles of my roofline and measuring the exact physical distance between my exterior brick walls and the neighboring wooden fences. They were definitely not admiring the classic architecture. They were methodically mapping the physical, tactical boundaries of a highly secure operational zone. They were actively calculating potential access points, mapping out viable escape routes, and carefully analyzing potential lines of sight from the quiet street to ensure total privacy. The taller man reached carefully into his suit jacket and retrieved a large smartphone. He held it up directly in front of his face, tapping the illuminated digital screen to initiate a live video call. The bright glow of the display reflected sharply against his harsh, angular features. He slowly turned the phone around, using the rear camera to show the impatient person on the other end the real-time layout of my private property. He deliberately panned the device across the entire length of my driveway, pointing the lens specifically toward the wooden gate that securely guarded my expansive backyard. As he shifted his wide stance on my front walkway, the angle of the glowing screen shifted perfectly into my narrow line of sight through the dark bay window. Even from my safely concealed distance inside the quiet house, the familiar image on the screen was entirely unmistakable. I clearly saw my own son. Brad's face fully occupied the digital frame, his expression taut with nervous, greedy anticipation. He was currently sitting safely inside his luxurious home office, completely insulated from the dangerous work happening right on my front lawn. He was actively directing these dangerous men. I watched in total silent horror as Brad pointed his index finger on the screen, gesturing emphatically toward the dark side yard that led straight to the unraked leaves. A massive wave of clarity washed over my entire being. The dying words of Mr. Caldwell echoed in the quiet living room. Brad's partners. A clean name. The soil. The horrific scope of this operation finally laid itself bare in my mind. This was not a greedy son trying to steal a modest family inheritance. This was a highly organized, deeply entrenched, and incredibly violent criminal enterprise operating on a massive scale. Brad had deliberately sold his soul to climb out of his crushing financial ruin. His wealthy investors were ruthless men who required untraceable locations to bury their darkest secrets. They needed quiet residential properties legally owned by respectable citizens with zero criminal ties. My pristine reputation as a dedicated civil engineer provided the ultimate perfect cover story for their illicit operations. Brad had intentionally manipulated me into signing those complex legal documents weeks ago, transferring the power of attorney so he could freely grant these men unrestricted access to my private land. He had knowingly marked his childhood home as a literal dumping ground for a violent syndicate. The weight of his treachery was too heavy to bear. He was willing to sacrifice my quiet life, my spotless honor, and my safety just to maintain his pathetic facade of manufactured wealth. The two men quickly finished photographing the front exterior and moved deliberately toward the wooden side gate. I tracked their every movement through the narrow slit in the velvet drapes, my aging muscles tense and ready for sudden action. They did not attempt to force the gate open, likely knowing from Brad it was securely locked from the inside. Instead, they leaned heavily over the top of the wooden slats, peering directly into the pitch-black expanse of my private backyard. The taller man held the smartphone high above his head, allowing Brad a clear digital view of the dark grounds. The heavily built man produced a flashlight and aimed the powerful beam straight into the thick darkness. The harsh white light cut fiercely through the deep shadows, landing precisely on the massive pile of dead autumn leaves situated near the back fence. It was the exact same area I had just spent agonizing hours surrounding with hidden trail cameras. The shorter man reached his long leg over the low section of the fence and kicked incredibly hard at the outer edge of the dry leaf pile. The brittle leaves scattered instantly into the cold wind, revealing exactly what lay deliberately hidden beneath them. It was not normal, naturally compacted garden soil. It was freshly turned loose and completely disturbed black dirt. The menacing man retracted his leg and turned back toward his partner. He offered a slow, deeply sinister smile, raising his thumb in a clear, confirming gesture directly to Brad on the video screen. The live feed abruptly terminated. The men turned in silence, sliding into the black SUV. The engine roared, and the vehicle glided smoothly down the street, disappearing into the dark night. I remained crouching behind the drapes, staring fiercely at the exact spot where they stood. The terrifying puzzle was undeniably solved. I now knew exactly where Ground Zero was. I remained perfectly motionless in the dark living room until the heavy rumble of the black SUV faded. The immediate threat had passed, but I could not stay inside this compromised house tonight. I needed specialized help assistance that did not come from standard legal channels. I needed someone who operated comfortably within the gray spaces of criminal investigations. I gathered my keys and slipped silently out the back door, navigating the narrow alleyway to avoid lingering surveillance. I walked briskly for 4 blocks under the dim streetlights until I reached my deliberately parked pickup truck. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and merged quietly onto the deserted highway. My destination was a 24-hour diner situated on the edge of the county line. The drive took 30 agonizing minutes, every mile marked by the haunting memory of Mr. Caldwell lying battered in that sterile hospital bed. When I finally pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot, the red diner sign hummed with a low electric buzz. I pushed through the heavy glass doors into the smell of stale coffee. I scanned the empty room and immediately spotted him sitting in a secluded corner booth, his back firmly against the wall. Richard was an old, trusted fishing buddy, but long before we ever shared a quiet boat on the lake, he had been a highly decorated forensic accountant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He had spent 30 grueling years meticulously dismantling organized crime syndicates by tracing their hidden money. He was a man of very few words, possessing a mind as sharp as a steel trap. I slid into the worn vinyl booth across from him. He did not offer a warm greeting or a smile. He simply pushed a steaming mug of black coffee across the table toward me and waited. I took a deep breath and laid everything out. I kept my voice incredibly low, strictly maintaining my emotional restraint. I channeled the intense, disciplined focus I had utilized when building massive bridges for 40 years. I methodically detailed the terrified warning at the pharmacy, the topological scan hidden in Brad's coffee cup, the brutal attack on the old man, the heavy metal briefcase concealed in my office, and the menacing men who had just inspected my backyard. Richard listened in absolute unbroken silence. His sharp eyes never left my face, processing the chaotic flood of information with chilling, professional detachment. When I finished my harrowing account, the silence between us felt heavier than lead. Richard slowly reached into his battered old leather satchel and pulled out a sleek, heavily encrypted laptop. He opened the screen, his thick fingers flying rapidly across the keyboard, bypassing standard security firewalls and tapping directly into restricted federal databases. The harsh blue light of the digital screen reflected off his glasses as he began running a silent, comprehensive background check on my son's commercial real estate firm. I sat perfectly still, watching the grim concentration harden on his weathered face. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound was the soft clatter of his typing and the distant hum of the kitchen exhaust fan. Then Richard finally stopped. He let out a heavy sigh, pulling his glasses off and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked at me with sympathetic gravity. He kept his voice barely above a whisper, telling me the situation was far worse than I had initially calculated. He revealed that Brad's real estate company had been actively flagged by federal monitors for over 8 months. His firm was not a legitimate business enterprise. It was a sophisticated, high-volume front designed to seamlessly launder massive amounts of illegal cash for a notoriously violent overseas syndicate. Richard explained the dark mechanics of the operation. The syndicate funneled their dirty money into Brad's firm through fake construction contracts and ghost development projects. Brad would then purchase legitimate materials, effectively washing the illicit funds clean through the complex American real estate market. But recently, the operation had shifted. The syndicate required secure, entirely off-the-grid locations to temporarily bury massive shipments of untraceable physical currency and highly illegal contraband. They needed clean, unassuming residential properties owned by people with zero criminal history to use as temporary holding vaults. My pristine, decades-long reputation as a decorated civil engineer made my private home the absolute perfect, unsuspicious target for their dangerous ground zero. The reality of my son's ultimate betrayal threatened to suffocate me. Brad had deliberately offered his father up as a human shield to protect his criminal handlers. I stared down at my cold coffee, the dark liquid reflecting the inescapable devastation in my eyes. I asked Richard if there was any viable way to physically secure my property, to block them from bringing heavy excavation machinery onto my land while we gathered enough concrete evidence to safely involve federal authorities. I suggested we could immediately file a strict restraining order or place a temporary legal freeze on any structural modifications to the residential deed. Richard did not respond immediately. His eyes dropped back down to the glowing screen of his laptop. His thick fingers tapped the keyboard a few more times, pulling up the official, publicly accessible county property records for my specific address. He wanted to verify if Brad had foolishly attempted to file any preliminary excavation permits under my name. As the digital document loaded onto the screen, Richard's face suddenly drained of all color. He froze completely, leaning much closer to the monitor, as if he could not quite believe the dense legal text displayed before him. He slowly turned the laptop around, pushing it across the sticky table so the bright screen faced me directly. I put on my reading glasses and squinted at the digital document. It was the official county deed to my home. The exact same house I had lovingly constructed with my own 2 hands 40 years ago. The very house where my late wife and I had raised our family. But the legal name listed under the current property ownership line was no longer mine. According to the legally binding document staring back at me, the estate had been officially transferred exactly 3 days ago. The new legal owner was a completely faceless, untraceable corporate shell company tied to Brad's commercial development firm. My mind flashed back to the memory of Brad visiting my house just a few weeks ago. He had presented a thick stack of complex legal papers, aggressively insisting they were simply harmless routine tax forms desperately needed to finalize the lingering details of my late wife's estate. He had been so incredibly rushed, forcefully pointing exactly where my signature was required. I had blindly trusted him. I had signed the documents without proper scrutiny. That lie had granted him full, unrestricted power of attorney. He had weaponized my signature to steal my property right out from under me. I sat paralyzed in the diner booth, staring blankly at the glowing screen. The dangerous men in the black SUV were not trespassing on my land tonight. Legally speaking, they were standing on their own property. I no longer owned the home I had built. I was officially homeless. I sat frozen in the diner booth, the lights buzzing overhead, as the devastating reality settled over me. The digital deed glowing on Richard's laptop proved my own son had meticulously erased my existence. I had spent 40 years building a legacy, pouring my sweat and blood into that soil, only to be legally evicted by the boy I raised. Richard watched me with quiet sympathy, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding of betrayal. He closed the laptop, a definitive snap that echoed the absolute finality of my broken family. He asked what my next strategic move would be. A cold resolve replaced the shock running through my veins. I told him I needed to give Brad exactly what he wanted: an empty house. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket, my calloused hands steady now. I stepped out of the diner and into the freezing autumn air. I dialed Brad's number, actively transforming myself back into the weak, exhausted old man he desperately wanted me to be. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight with an underlying nervous energy. I let out a long sigh, pouring manufactured weariness into the receiver. I told him with a perfectly calibrated tremor in my voice that the events of the past few days had finally caught up with me. I admitted total defeat. I confessed that maintaining the property was simply too much for my aching bones, and I was ready to sign the admission papers for Whispering Pines. He quickly masked his soaring excitement with artificial sympathy. I continued my performance, telling him I needed a couple of days to clear my head and process this massive transition. I stated I was packing my gear and heading up to the northern lakes for a 2-day fishing trip. I told him it was a necessary chance to say a peaceful goodbye to my independent life before moving into the facility. The trap was perfectly set, and Brad swallowed the bait with absolute eagerness. He smoothly insisted that I should not worry about a single thing while I was gone. He enthusiastically volunteered to come over, check the heavy locks, and keep a close eye on the house. I thanked him profusely, maintaining the pathetic facade of a highly dependent father, and ended the call. I drove back to my stolen house to pack my fishing gear. The physical act of walking through the front door felt different this time. The thick walls I painted, the hardwood floors I installed, the warm living room where my late wife used to read her evening novels. It all felt like a hollow stage set. I walked into the garage and pulled my heavy canvas duffel bag down from the high wooden shelf. As I mechanically loaded my tackle box, waterproof boots, and insulated jacket, the profound sting of betrayal washed over me anew. My son was not just stealing my physical property and financial security. He was pushing me into an early grave, rushing me into a facility where my independence would wither all, so he could hand my home over to criminals. He was turning my sanctuary into a dark graveyard for their illegal secrets. Every metal zipper I pulled, every plastic buckle I fastened, solidified the cold barrier around my heart. I was no longer an older father trying to reason with a misguided son. I was an experienced civil engineer systematically isolating a critical structural failure to prevent a catastrophic collapse. I slung the heavy bag over my shoulder and walked briskly out of the garage. I did not look back at the dark windows or the empty porch. I locked the front door knowing the brass key resting in my hand was now completely useless. I climbed into my pickup truck, started the engine, and backed slowly out of the driveway. I made a highly visible show of driving toward the northbound interstate ramp, ensuring anyone watching from the shadows would believe I was genuinely leaving town for the weekend. I drove steadily north for precisely 15 miles, blending seamlessly into the sparse late-night traffic. Once I was absolutely certain I was not being followed by any unmarked vehicles, I took a sudden exit, navigating expertly through a maze of winding backroads. I circled back toward the southern industrial edge of the county, finally arriving at a completely isolated, abandoned manufacturing park. Tucked safely away behind a massive, decaying warehouse was Richard's private, highly secure garage. The corrugated metal door rolled up with a quiet mechanical hum as I approached. I pulled my truck inside, completely disappearing from the outside world. The metal door slammed shut behind me. The interior of the spacious garage was entirely retrofitted into a sophisticated tactical command center. Thick blackout curtains covered the high glass windows. Multiple high-resolution digital monitors glowed brightly against the cold, cinder-block walls, illuminating the dark space with a harsh blue light. Richard was sitting at a large folding table connecting his encrypted network routers and organizing a complex array of digital servers. I pulled up a rigid metal chair beside him, placing my secure cellular phone on the table. I synced my device to his master terminal, routing the private video feeds from the 4 military-grade trail cameras I had hidden in my backyard oak trees directly to his high-definition screens. The wireless transmission stabilized rapidly, and the 4 monitors flickered to life. The specialized infrared lenses provided a crisp, high-contrast, black and white view of my deserted backyard. The cold wind rustled the bare branches, creating shifting, ghostly shadows across the thick blanket of fallen leaves. We sat in the dark garage drinking lukewarm black coffee from foam cups, waiting in absolute, highly disciplined military silence. The glowing digital clock on the bottom right corner of the primary screen ticked forward methodically. 11 o'clock passed without a single disruption. 11:30 came and went. The suffocating tension in the cold room was thick enough to cut with a heavy steel blade. I watched the screens intently, my aging eyes burning slightly from the relentless glare of the monitors. I thought about the terrified old man fighting for his life in the hospital bed. I thought about the thick architectural drafting paper hidden carelessly in the coffee cup. I thought about the cold, calculating smile on Sarah's face when she confidently told me I could easily slip and fall, and no one would ever know. The scattered, terrifying pieces were perfectly aligned. The stage was empty, primed, and ready for the impending destruction. The digital clock turned to exactly midnight. Suddenly, a sharp alert chimed loudly from the central computer terminal. The primary motion sensor on the northernmost oak tree camera had just been triggered. I leaned forward, gripping the hard edge of the metal table with absolute intensity. On the main monitor, the infrared feed shifted slightly as the heavy wooden gate at the far side of my private property swung open violently. A pair of incredibly bright headlights pierced the black and white feed, casting long beams across the damp grass. A massive excavation vehicle was slowly rolling directly into my backyard. The heavy vehicle groaned to a halt beyond the wooden fence line, its tires tearing through the damp grass of my lawn. In the cold light of Richard's hidden garage, we stared intensely at the glowing monitors. The infrared cameras captured every detail in stark black and white. The vehicle was an oversized tactical transport truck. The engine cut off, plunging my backyard back into absolute silence. The four doors of the truck swung open simultaneously. Brad and Sarah stepped out into the freezing night, followed closely by the two broad-shouldered men I had observed earlier. The men moved straight to the rear of the truck, throwing open the cargo doors. They retrieved 4 reinforced steel shovels and a pair of pickaxes. They were opting for manual labor to avoid drawing the attention of my sleeping neighbors. They moved swiftly through the gate, their boots crushing brown leaves. Richard leaned forward and tapped a sequence of keys on his laptop. The digital audio feed kicked in, sending sound through the external speakers. The rustling of the wind and the crunching of boots filled the quiet command center. They marched directly toward the massive pile of unraked leaves near the back boundary of my property. The taller unknown man violently kicked the remaining leaves aside, fully exposing the loose, recently disturbed soil beneath. Brad stood near the edge of the designated digging zone, gripping his shovel with a hesitant posture. He looked nervously toward the dark windows of my empty house, terrified that his manufactured story about my fishing trip might be a lie. He wiped a bead of nervous sweat from his brow, trembling. Then a voice sliced through the audio feed, sharp, commanding, and devoid of any warmth. It was Sarah. The patronizing tone she always used when speaking to me was entirely gone. Her voice was pure venom. She aggressively ordered Brad to stop staring at the dark house and start digging immediately. She told him that the syndicate was running on a tight schedule and that they did not have time for his pathetic cowardice. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on the monitor, stunned by the venomous transformation. The fragile, delicate daughter-in-law, who gently placed her cold hand over mine at the dinner table, was a complete fabrication. The woman barking harsh, unforgiving orders at my son was a ruthless operative. She was actively driving his reckless financial schemes. She was the hardened syndicate liaison firmly holding his tight leash. Brad weakly protested, complaining that the ground was densely packed and that his hands were blistering from the cold steel shaft of the shovel. Sarah stepped aggressively into his personal space, her face inches from his. The camera captured the pure contempt twisting her features. She degraded him mercilessly, calling him a weak, pathetic excuse for a man. She sharply reminded him that his financial failures had nearly gotten them both killed 6 months ago, and that this specific excavation was the only reason the syndicate had allowed him to keep breathing. She ordered him to dig until his hands bled, stating that he owed his miserable life to the very dirt he was standing on. Brad visibly shrank under her fierce verbal assault. He swallowed hard, completely, stripping away the businessman persona he paraded around in public. He was a terrified pawn. He plunged his shovel deep into the dark earth. Richard and I watched in silence as the 3 men tore into the soil of my backyard. The infrared feed highlighted the heat radiating from their bodies as they worked. Mounds of dark earth piled up rapidly around the perimeter of the growing trench. The physical exertion was immense. Brad was gasping for air, his chest heaving violently, but he did not dare stop to rest under Sarah's terrifying, watchful gaze. She paced the edge of the deepening hole like a prison warden, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, constantly checking the illuminated face of her expensive wristwatch. The minutes dragged on with agonizing slowness. The hole grew wider and deeper, surpassing 4 feet in depth. I felt anger welling up inside me. My peaceful sanctuary, where my late wife had lovingly planted azaleas, was being desecrated by criminals. I kept my breathing slow and steady. Suddenly, a loud metallic clink echoed sharply through the audio speakers. The harsh sound of solid steel striking thick metal cut through the rhythmic scraping of the shovels. The 2 men instantly stopped digging. Brad dropped his shovel, completely collapsing to his knees at the muddy edge of the dark trench. He was panting heavily, wiping wet mud across his pale forehead. Sarah leaned eagerly over the dark precipice, a triumphant smile spreading across her sharp face. She ordered the men to pull them out carefully, reminding them that the contents were worth more than their miserable lives combined. The two broad-shouldered men dropped into the deep hole, their boots sinking into the wet mud. They grunted with intense physical effort, grabbing hold of thick, reinforced nylon straps buried in the loose dirt. With a synchronized heave, the two men hoisted a massive object out of the trench and dropped it. It landed heavily onto the grass. It was a large military duffel bag securely fastened with heavy steel padlocks. They reached back down into the darkness and hauled up a second identical bag, letting it fall with a heavy thud next to the first. Then they reached down one final time and extracted a third heavy bag, dragging it onto the damaged lawn. The three massive duffel bags sat in a row, radiating a cold, undeniable menace. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that those bags were stuffed with millions of dollars in illicit currency and highly illegal contraband. The syndicate was finally moving their hidden stash. They were successfully extracting their buried treasure from my stolen property. Richard let out a long, quiet breath beside me, stating that we finally had all the concrete evidence we needed. He told me that once they loaded those heavy bags into the truck, we could call his federal contacts. I felt a surge of profound relief wash over my tired body. The trap had worked flawlessly. We had successfully caught them red-handed. But as I watched the monitors waiting for the men to carry the bags toward their waiting vehicle, my relief violently evaporated. They were not leaving. The two men climbed out of the muddy trench and stood silently beside the retrieved duffel bags. Sarah turned her cold, calculating gaze toward Brad, who was still kneeling in the damp dirt, gasping for air. She gave him a sharp, subtle nod. Brad slowly climbed to his feet. He reached deep inside his ruined suit jacket and pulled out a thick, tightly bound bundle of pristine white documents, wrapped securely in transparent plastic. He held the thick bundle tightly in his muddy hands, staring down into the dark, empty hole they had just excavated. He stepped dangerously close to the muddy edge, raising his arms, and prepared to drop the bundle of forged, highly incriminating documents directly into the open earth. The bundle of white documents fell through the cold air, landing with a thud against the wet bottom of the trench. Through the high-definition audio feed streaming into Richard's concealed garage, every sound was amplified with terrifying clarity. I sat perfectly rigid in my metal chair, my eyes locked on the glowing monitor, watching my son stand over the muddy grave he had just dug in the yard where he once played. The taller syndicate man stepped forward, shining his flashlight down into the hole. The beam illuminated the plastic-wrapped package resting in the dark earth. He turned his cold gaze toward Brad, his voice a dangerous rumble vibrating through the laptop speakers. He demanded to know exactly what Brad had just thrown into the excavation site. He sharply reminded my son that their strict instructions were only to retrieve the $5 million in currency packed inside the duffel bags, not to leave any trace behind. Brad held his hands up in a placating gesture, desperate to maintain control of the escalating situation. His voice trembled slightly, but a sickening undercurrent of arrogant pride bled into his words. He told the syndicate operative to relax, insisting that the buried documents were the absolute key to keeping all of them out of federal prison. He pointed down at the trench, boasting that he had spent the last 6 months preparing a foolproof contingency plan for their money laundering operation. Sarah stepped out of the shadows, wrapping her arms tightly around herself to ward off the biting wind. She offered the syndicate men a wicked conspiratorial smile, instructing them to listen very closely to her husband. She claimed it was a brilliant strategy that would guarantee their total immunity. Brad cleared his throat, gaining a morbid surge of confidence. He explicitly detailed his treacherous plot, his words striking me like physical blows in the quiet command center. He explained the plastic bundle contained highly detailed, extensively forged financial ledgers. Those ledgers meticulously documented every ghost construction contract, every shell corporation, and every illicit transaction their syndicate had processed over the past year. But he emphasized with a dark chuckle those ledgers did not contain his name or Sarah's name or the names of any active syndicate members. Instead, Brad proudly confessed he had spent countless hours forging my signature on every single page. He had tied the entire criminal enterprise directly to my spotless professional record as a civil engineer. He explained to the men my pristine reputation was the ultimate cover story, making the fabricated paper trail look like the tragic downfall of a highly respected old man operating a shadow empire from his suburban home. The shorter syndicate man crossed his massive arms over his chest, listening intently as Brad laid out the impending timeline of my absolute destruction. Brad excitedly revealed his immediate next steps. He stated that by tomorrow afternoon, he would successfully manipulate me into signing the permanent admission papers for the Whispering Pines assisted living facility. He told them I was already broken, a tired old man practically begging to be locked away. Once I was safely institutionalized and removed from the property, Brad's masterstroke would commence. He explained he would use a completely untraceable burner phone to make an anonymous tip directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He would guide the agents straight to this address, instructing them to dig us up the loose soil near the back fence. Sarah chimed in, her voice dripping with cruel amusement. She cheerfully added the authorities would unearth the forged ledgers alongside trace amounts of the physical currency they were extracting tonight. The FBI would see a watertight case against a retired engineer who allegedly lost his mind to greed. She laughed, a sharp sound echoing through the garage, predicting the stress of a federal indictment would likely cause my fragile heart to give out before I ever saw the inside of a courtroom. Brad nodded enthusiastically in agreement. He told the dangerous men I would inevitably take the sole fall for the entire laundering operation. I would be federally indicted, utterly disgraced, and I would undoubtedly die in a cold prison cell, taking all their darkest secrets to my grave. In exchange, Brad and Sarah would legally inherit my unblemished real estate assets insulated from the ensuing federal fallout, while the syndicate walked away entirely clean to easily set up their next lucrative front. The taller syndicate man stared at Brad for a long, silent moment. The infrared camera captured the slight nod of approval he finally offered. He gruffly praised the ruthless efficiency of the plan, stating he never realized Brad possessed the stomach to sacrifice his own father. Brad simply shrugged his shoulders in the cold night air, callously dismissing my entire existence with a casual wave of his hand. He stated that business was simply business, and I had already outlived my practical usefulness. They grabbed the 3 duffel bags, dragging the $5 million across my ruined lawn. They loaded the bags into the rear of the black SUV, slamming the heavy doors shut. Brad and Sarah quickly grabbed their shovels and pushed a layer of loose dirt over the plastic-wrapped ledgers, burying the fake evidence before rushing to their vehicle. Within minutes, the driveway was empty. The motion sensor light clicked off, plunging my home back into darkness, leaving behind a perfectly set trap meant to end my life. In the isolated command center, the sudden silence was deafening. I sat paralyzed in my metal chair, staring blankly at the monitors. The bitter black coffee in my cup had gone cold. Beside me, Richard slowly removed his glasses, letting out a heavy exhale. He did not attempt to offer any hollow words of comfort. He knew exactly what I had just witnessed. He knew that I had just watched my only son casually sign my death warrant. The profound, crushing sadness that had briefly threatened to break my spirit vanished entirely. The lingering, desperate hope that Brad was simply a misguided child evaporated into the cold air of the concrete garage. He was not a victim of circumstance. He was not being coerced. He was the malicious, calculating architect of my impending doom. He had meticulously designed a structural nightmare intended to completely crush me under its immense, unavoidable weight. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, measured breath. I envisioned the towering steel suspension bridges I had built throughout my career. I thought about the absolute precision required to ensure that thousands of tons of concrete held firm against hurricane winds. I remembered the calculations needed to safely demolish a failing structure without causing collateral damage. My son had tragically miscalculated my strength. He genuinely believed I was a weak foundation that would crumble under his artificial pressure. He failed to realize I possessed the blueprints to tear his operation down to the bedrock. When I opened my eyes, the sorrow was gone, replaced by cold resolve. I turned to Richard, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. I told him it was time to drop the bridge. Richard did not hesitate or ask for clarification. He understood the gravity of my words and the absolute finality in my voice. He reached across the metal folding table and pulled a highly secure, heavily encrypted satellite phone from the depths of his worn leather satchel. He bypassed the standard cellular networks, dialing a direct unlisted number that connected straight to his former colleagues, actively serving in the Federal Financial Crimes Division. As the line connected, Richard rapidly summarized the escalating situation with crisp military precision. He calmly reported a confirmed high-level money laundering extraction currently in progress at a residential target. He explicitly detailed the presence of $5 million in illicit physical currency, the involvement of known syndicate operatives, and the active destruction and burial of deeply forged federal evidence. To permanently cement the undeniable urgency of the raid, Richard seamlessly linked our live, high-definition infrared camera feed directly to the Federal Operations Center in downtown Atlanta. The sheer magnitude of the hard evidence streaming across their secure screens triggered an instantaneous, overwhelming response. A specialized tactical strike team already stationed on night standby was officially mobilized within mere minutes. Richard ended the secure call and gently closed the encrypted laptop on the table. He turned his weathered face toward me, his expression marked by a grim, professional solemnity. He instructed me to stay safely hidden inside the reinforced walls of his abandoned command center. He warned me that the ensuing federal raid would be incredibly chaotic, highly dangerous, and exceptionally violent. He practically begged me to spare my aging heart, the agonizing trauma of physically watching my only son get dragged away in cold steel handcuffs. I looked back at my trusted friend, my voice steady and devoid of any lingering hesitation. I absolutely refused to hide in the shadows while my stolen house was raided. I told Richard that my son had meticulously planned to frame me for federal crimes, intending to leave me rotting in a dark prison cell for the rest of my natural life. I firmly stated that I needed to be standing right there on my own property when the heavy trap finally snapped shut. I needed to look Brad directly in his eyes the exact moment he realized his brilliant, treacherous empire had completely collapsed. Richard stared into my unwavering gaze for a long moment, silently recognizing the stubborn, unbreakable resolve of a devastated father. He simply nodded, grabbed his keys from the metal table, and led the way out to his unmarked vehicle. The drive back towards my suburban neighborhood was consumed by a heavy, suffocating silence. The cold autumn darkness slipped past the passenger window in a continuous blurry stream. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the illuminated dashboard, letting the rhythmic hum of the engine ground my racing thoughts. As we sped down the deserted highway, a profound, heavy mourning finally washed over my exhausted soul. I was not mourning the impending loss of my physical property or the bitter betrayal of my financial trust. I was deeply, irrevocably mourning the tragic death of the innocent boy I had raised. I pictured a young Brad running through the summer sprinklers, his face glowing with pure, unadulterated joy. I remembered teaching him how to confidently ride his first bicycle, how to properly bait a fishing hook, and how to tie a Windsor knot before his high school graduation. I had poured every ounce of my love, my strict discipline, and my hard-earned wisdom into shaping his character. But the stark, brutal reality was that the little boy I loved no longer existed. He had been entirely consumed by his insatiable greed, completely replaced by a cold, calculating monster who viewed his own father as a disposable pawn in a violent syndicate game. The heartbreaking realization tore through my chest, but it also brought a strange, cold clarity. I was no longer fighting to desperately save my son from his terrible mistakes. I was actively stepping forward to permanently neutralize a highly dangerous threat to my own survival. I realized that protecting my hard-earned legacy required me to completely abandon my fragile, lingering paternal instincts forever. I severed the deep emotional tethers that bound me to him, locking the precious, untainted memories away in a highly secure, safe corner of my mind. The man currently burying forged federal documents in my backyard was a ruthless criminal, and he absolutely needed to be brought to swift final justice tonight. Richard killed the headlights 3 blocks away from my quiet street, gliding the heavy vehicle smoothly to a silent halt near the corner of the neighborhood park. The tactical federal response was already silently forming a massive perimeter. Unmarked black vans and heavily armored tactical vehicles were strategically positioned at every possible intersection, completely sealing off all viable escape routes from my residential cul-de-sac. Heavily armed federal agents dressed in dark specialized tactical gear moved with terrifying speed and absolute silence through the shadows of the neighboring yards. Richard flashed his retired federal credentials to a perimeter guard, granting us secure access to the mobile command unit parked discreetly behind a tall line of evergreen trees. We stepped into the cramped, glowing interior of the surveillance van, surrounded by focused agents tracking the live feeds from my trail cameras. On the primary digital screen, the grim scene in my backyard was rapidly reaching its absolute climax. The massive hole in the dark earth was nearly filled. Brad stood at the edge of the muddy trench, using the flat back of his heavy steel shovel to firmly pack the damp soil over the buried forged ledgers. He was breathing heavily, his expensive suit completely ruined by the wet dirt and physical exertion. The 2 syndicate operatives had already loaded the 3 heavy duffel bags into the rear cargo hold of their idling truck. They stood near the open tailgate, their posture relaxed, believing they had successfully extracted their illicit wealth without triggering a single alarm. Sarah was standing close to Brad, her arms crossed confidently over her chest, watching him finish his dark labor. The cold wind whipped her hair across her face, but she did not flinch. She simply watched the earth swallow the final piece of their treacherous puzzle. Brad tossed his muddy shovel aside, letting it clatter loudly against the wooden fence. He wiped his dirty brow with the back of his trembling hand, turning to face his wife. He let out a long, shuddering breath, a massive wave of visible relief washing over his tense features. He offered Sarah a wide, sickeningly triumphant smile, completely convinced that he had just secured his flawless escape and successfully finalized the ultimate destruction of my life. He reached his hand out toward her, ready to celebrate their perfect crime. Suddenly, the absolute tranquil darkness of the quiet backyard was violently and permanently shattered without any prior warning. A dozen blinding high-intensity tactical federal floodlights ignited simultaneously from every single possible angle, completely illuminating the entire yard with the harsh, inescapable, brilliant brightness of a midday sun, instantly freezing the criminals in their muddy tracks. The deafening crack of a digital megaphone shattered the freezing night air. FBI, drop the shovels, put your hands in the air. The booming command echoed off the brick walls of my home, a home that was no longer mine, but one that was about to serve as the perfect stage for my son's ultimate downfall. Heavily armored tactical agents swarmed the perimeter with terrifying synchronized precision. They poured swiftly over the wooden perimeter fences and poured out from the dark side yards, their assault rifles raised and laser sights cutting sharp red lines through the muddy darkness. The 2 broad-shouldered syndicate operatives did not even attempt to put up a pointless fight. They were seasoned career criminals who immediately recognized the overwhelming disparity in tactical force. They dropped their heavy steel pickaxes into the wet grass and slowly raised their empty hands, lacing their fingers behind their heads as they dropped to their knees in the mud. They knew the drill perfectly. They accepted their capture with a cold, absolute professional resignation. They had absolutely no chance of escaping the coordinated federal strike team tonight. Brad, however, completely unraveled. The blinding glare of the tactical floodlights illuminated the absolute abject terror tearing across his face. He stumbled backward, his muddy boots slipping on the slick, torn grass near the edge of the deep trench. The heavy steel shovel slipped from his trembling grip, hitting the ground with a dull thud. His perfectly constructed facade of arrogant superiority instantly evaporated. revealing the pathetic, desperate coward hiding underneath. As the federal agents closed in, shouting continuous orders to freeze, Brad's survival instinct kicked in. It was an instinct built entirely on treachery and deflection. He threw his hands into the air and immediately began shouting frantic, hysterical lies at the approaching officers. His voice cracked with high-pitched panic as he pointed a muddy finger desperately toward the dark silhouette of my house. "Wait! You have to listen to me!" he screamed, his words tumbling out in a rapid, pathetic rush. "'Tis my dad's property. I swear to God I didn't know this was here. My dad forced us to dig it up." He was actively trying to execute his meticulously crafted fallback plan, desperately attempting to frame me right in front of the federal strike team. He frantically continued his desperate monologue, pointing down into the deep hole. "Look at the ledgers. The ledgers have his signature. He is the one running this. He is a crazy old man, and he made me do it." Every single word he screamed was a sharp, final nail in the coffin of our relationship. He was perfectly willing to send me to a federal penitentiary for the rest of my natural life, if it meant he could escape the devastating consequences of his own greedy actions. He honestly believed his wild lies would actually work. I stepped slowly out from the concealed shadow of the heavy wooden side gate. Richard walked silently right beside me, his federal credentials prominently displayed on his outer jacket. The armed tactical agents immediately recognized him and smoothly parted ways, creating a clear, unobstructed path for me to walk directly into the center of my ruined backyard. The blinding tactical lights cast incredibly long, sharp shadows across the mud. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured, and deliberate pace of a man who had completely reclaimed his stolen power. I felt the wet grass crush beneath the heavy soles of my boots. I completely ignored the heavily armed federal officers who were actively and systematically securing the outer perimeter of the crime scene. Instead, I focused absolutely all of my unyielding attention entirely on the pathetic, trembling man standing right at the muddy edge of the dark, freshly dug trench. I stepped forcefully into the harsh, glowing circle of those bright tactical floodlights and stood perfectly still, letting my presence register. I stood directly in front of my son. Brad stopped screaming mid-sentence. The hysterical, high-pitched pleas died instantly in his throat. His wide, frantic eyes locked onto my face and the remaining color completely drained from his cheeks. He went absolutely chalk white, looking exactly like a man who had just seen a ghost rise from the cold grave. His jaw opened and closed silently, struggling to comprehend the impossible reality standing before him. He had meticulously calculated every single variable of his treacherous plan except for one. He had arrogantly assumed I was safely miles away, blindly packing my bags for a miserable life in a nursing home. He never imagined that the clueless old man he so deeply despised had been the one to orchestrate this massive federal sting. I stared directly into his terrified eyes, offering no anger, no sorrow, and absolutely no paternal warmth. The emotional bond that had connected me to him for decades was completely severed. I saw him not as my flesh and blood, but as a deeply flawed, highly destructive hazard that I had successfully neutralized. He was simply a common criminal facing severe justice. Sarah, who had remained frozen in shock near the open tailgate of the black SUV, suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. She correctly calculated that Brad's pathetic attempts at deflection had entirely failed, and her survival instincts demanded immediate flight. She spun around sharply, her heels digging deeply into the mud, and made a desperate sprinting dash toward the dark gap in the back fence. She did not even make it 5 yards. A heavily armored federal agent lunged forward with explosive speed, driving his shoulder squarely into her midsection. He tackled her forcefully into the wet grass, pinning her arms behind her back, with swift, undeniable authority. Her highly expensive clothing was instantly coated in thick, dark mud as she thrashed and screamed, spewing venomous curses at the arresting officers. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the night air finalized her capture. She was finally permanently detained, marking the absolute end of her vicious, highly manipulative reign. The sight of his wife being forcefully driven into the dirt completely shattered whatever fragile remnants of composure Brad still possessed. His legs buckled beneath him. He collapsed heavily down onto his knees in the cold mud, right beside the massive open trench he had dug to bury my reputation. The desperate arrogance that had fueled his entire criminal enterprise vanished, leaving behind nothing but raw, unfiltered desperation. He looked up at me from the dirt, his face streaked with tears and thick mud. The man who had just seconds ago tried to sentence me to a federal prison now switched his tactics from aggressive blame to incredibly pathetic begging. He reached his trembling hands out toward my boots, his voice breaking into a loud, miserable sob. "Dad, please," he wailed, the agonizing sound tearing through the quiet night. "Dad, tell them, please, you have to tell them it is yours. Tell them you made me do it." I stood over him, my posture rigid, and my expression completely unreadable. The blinding floodlights illuminated his terrified, pleading face, but I felt absolutely nothing. My once warm, fiercely protective heart was entirely cold, replaced by cold, absolute resolve. The mud soaked deeply into the knees of his expensive, tailored trousers, permanently staining the fine fabric with the very dirt he had proudly planned to use as my financial grave. I looked down at the pathetic, trembling figure groveling at my boots. The harsh, unforgiving glare of the federal tactical lights entirely stripped away every last ounce of the polished corporate executive he pretended to be revealing, only the hollow, terrified core of a desperate criminal. The heavily armed agents stood frozen in a tight, impenetrable perimeter around us, their weapons lowered safely, but their professional attention remaining absolute. The deafening silence of the freezing autumn night was broken only by the ragged, pathetic sound of my son sobbing into the damp earth. He continued to plead endlessly, his voice cracking with high-pitched desperation as he frantically searched my stoic face for a single shred of the paternal mercy he had so casually planned to exploit. He still firmly believed that he could manipulate his way out of this perfectly executed trap, that he could somehow convince the federal authorities that his elderly dependent father was the true mastermind behind the staggering mountain of illicit currency piled in the open cargo bay of their idling tactical vehicle. He was operating on pure blind panic, completely unable to comprehend the absolute totality of his sudden defeat. The silent syndicate operatives watched him with profound disgust, knowing his cowardly lies were utterly useless. I did not offer him a single word of comfort, nor did I raise my voice in anger. I slowly reached into the deep inner pocket of my insulated winter jacket. Brad's frantic pleading hitched sharply in his throat, his wide, tear-streaked eyes tracking my deliberate movement with animalistic fear. I withdrew a sleek digital tablet, the heavy glass screen cold against my calloused fingertips. I tapped the illuminated display, quickly accessing the secure, encrypted server where Richard had meticulously routed the live audio feed from the covert microphones hidden throughout the backyard canopy. I maximized the digital volume on the device, ensuring the internal speakers were pushed to their absolute physical limit. With a steady, unwavering hand, I pressed the digital play button. The crystal-clear, undeniably authentic recording of Brad's own arrogant voice instantly echoed through the quiet suburban night. The pristine audio playback captured every single treacherous syllable he had spoken just minutes prior. The federal agents, the remaining syndicate operatives, and Sarah, who was still pinned forcefully against the damp grass, listened in absolute silence as Brad's recorded voice proudly boasted about forging my signature on the criminal ledgers. The yard was filled with the chilling sound of his explicit confession, detailing exactly how he planned to tip off the federal authorities the moment I was locked away in a nursing home. The recording even captured Sarah's cruel, venomous laugh as she eagerly anticipated my death in a federal prison. The recorded audio broadcasted his meticulously calculated plot to let me die alone in a maximum security penitentiary so he could walk away completely clean with my stolen assets. The sheer undeniable clarity of the digital recording hung heavily in the freezing autumn air, serving as an ironclad, indisputable confession to a highly organized federal conspiracy. Brad remained completely paralyzed in the thick mud, his mouth hanging open, as the devastating sound of his own treacherous words washed over him. The remaining blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, broken shell. He slowly realized that his ultimate fallback plan, his cowardly attempt to frame me for his incredibly severe crimes, had been completely captured on a secure federal recording. There was absolutely no room for interpretation, no clever legal loophole for his expensive lawyers to exploit, and no possible way to shift the heavy blame onto an innocent old man. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing man with sharp, intelligent eyes and a stern, weathered face, stepped decisively forward into the illuminated circle. He did not issue any further verbal commands or listen to any more pathetic excuses. He simply reached down, grabbed Brad roughly by the muddy collar of his ruined suit jacket, and hauled him forcefully to his feet with undeniable authority. Brad offered absolutely no physical resistance, as the powerful agent forcefully spun him around and slammed him face first against the cold, muddy side of the tactical extraction truck. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs clamping down tightly around Brad's wrists echoed through the yard with a satisfying, absolute finality. I watched the physical restraint being firmly applied, feeling a profound, heavy sense of closure settle deep within my chest. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the physical distance between myself and the man who had completely destroyed our family. Brad turned his head slightly, pressing his muddy cheek against the cold metal of the vehicle, his terrified, weeping eyes seeking mine one final time. I spoke my very first words to him since the elaborate trap had been flawlessly set. My voice was completely devoid of any emotion, delivered with the calm, measured precision of an experienced engineer, accurately diagnosing a catastrophic structural failure. "You thought I was a clueless old man," I said quietly, ensuring the harsh words penetrated the chaotic noise of the active crime scene. "But I spent 40 years building foundations that do not crack. You built yours on dirt." The stark reality of his immense failure finally crushed whatever remained of his manufactured ego. Brad let out a loud, agonizing wail, a truly pathetic sound born of pure, absolute defeat. The lead federal agent jerked him backward, by his bound arms dragging him forcefully across the torn lawn toward the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting police cruisers parked tightly along the suburban street. Sarah was roughly hauled up from the wet grass, her highly expensive designer clothes completely ruined by the thick mud. She screamed vicious, unintelligible curses at the arresting officers as she was shoved aggressively into the back of a separate transport vehicle, her fierce resistance ultimately proving completely futile. The two silent syndicate men were marched away in heavy steel chains, their highly lucrative criminal careers effectively and permanently terminated. I stood completely alone in the center of my severely damaged backyard, surrounded by the deep, muddy trench and the scattered piles of dead autumn leaves. The tactical floodlights were powered down, returning my quiet home to the peaceful darkness I had always cherished. I turned my back on the empty, flashing street and walked slowly toward the back patio. I stepped inside the dark, silent house, moving with a calm, purposeful stride. I did not stop to rest in the kitchen or the living room. I walked straight down the familiar hallway and entered my quiet home office. I approached the heavy oak bookshelf, slid the thick wooden frame aside, and pulled the heavy metal briefcase from its dark, narrow void. I set the heavy steel casing firmly onto my wooden desk and reached my steady hands toward the complex dual combination dials, ready to finally unlock the absolute truth hidden deep within its core. The heavy metal dials of the steel briefcase clicked with a sharp, resonant finality under my steady fingers. I aligned the dual combinations I had carefully deduced from my son's habitual numerical patterns. The thick latches sprang open, releasing a stale breath of trapped air into my quiet home office. I lifted the heavy lid, expecting to find stacks of illicit currency, but the reality was far more damning. The padded interior was meticulously organized, holding a thick stack of manila folders and a series of encrypted external hard drives. I pulled out the top folder and spread the crisp white documents across my wooden desk. They were the original, entirely untampered property deeds, to my home completely devoid of any forged signatures or corporate shell company transfers. Beneath those deeds lay the syndicate's true, highly detailed digital ledgers. Brad had secretly documented every single illegal transaction, every ghost contract, and every laundered dollar with terrifying precision. He had deliberately maintained this pristine, highly incriminating evidence as his ultimate insurance policy. It was a calculated get-out-of-jail-free card, a devastating weapon he intended to use against his violent handlers if they ever threatened his life or his lucrative position. He had foolishly believed he could play both sides of a highly dangerous game, sacrificing his father to the federal authorities while holding the syndicate hostage with their own dark secrets. The sheer staggering magnitude of his absolute arrogance was permanently captured in those hidden files. I did not waste a single moment analyzing the complex financial data. I carefully returned the pristine documents to the padded casing and secured the heavy latches. I carried the heavy metal briefcase out to the front porch, where the lead federal agent was currently coordinating the massive crime scene cleanup. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the quiet suburban street, casting long, shifting shadows against the brick exterior of my home. I walked directly toward the imposing man and handed him the steel container. I looked him squarely in the eyes and explained exactly what he would find inside. I told him those hard drives contained the entire unedited financial history of the money laundering operation, cleanly detached from the forged nonsense Brad had buried in my backyard. The agent took the heavy briefcase, his stern expression softening into a look of profound, genuine respect. He assured me that this ironclad evidence would not only guarantee my complete exoneration, but would systematically dismantle the entire overseas syndicate from the top down. He immediately directed his legal team to initiate the expedited process of completely reversing the fraudulent property transfer. Within a matter of days, the false corporate deed would be entirely nullified, and my home would be legally, permanently restored to my name. My sanctuary was finally safe from the dark, grasping hands of criminals. I retreated back into the quiet warmth of my house, the adrenaline that had fueled my actions for the past 24 hours finally beginning to rapidly recede. A deep, heavy exhaustion settled into my aging bones, weighing down my shoulders and stiffening my tired joints. I walked slowly through the kitchen and stepped into the small utility mudroom located near the back entrance. I sat heavily on the wooden bench and looked down at my thick leather work boots. They were heavily caked in the thick, dark mud from the desecrated trench in my backyard. The damp soil clung stubbornly to the deep rubber treads, a physical lingering reminder of the violent treachery that had just poisoned my property. I grabbed a stiff bristled brush and a damp rag, methodically scraping the thick dirt away from the worn leather. Every aggressive stroke of the brush felt incredibly therapeutic, serving as a vital, necessary physical release of the immense emotional pressure I had been suppressing. I scrubbed the tough leather until my calloused hands ached, refusing to stop, until every last trace of that tainted soil was completely eradicated from my boots. I wanted no physical remnants of their dark sins tracking through the pristine halls of my home. The methodical, repetitive motion slowly grounded my racing mind, bringing me back to the peaceful, orderly reality I had fought so fiercely to protect. As I wiped the final traces of damp earth from the clean leather, a sudden, profound realization struck me with the intense force of a physical blow. My mind drifted back to the sterile, brightly lit room at the local pharmacy, returning to the terrified, battered face of old Mr. Caldwell. I remembered his trembling, bruised hands and the absolute paralyzing fear radiating from his swollen eyes. The scattered puzzle pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. Mr. Caldwell was not the victim of a random, unfortunate mugging. He was a tragic, desperate casualty of Brad's violent syndicate. The poor man must have somehow discovered their illicit operations, or perhaps his own quiet property had been aggressively targeted as a potential burial site before they ultimately shifted their dark focus onto me. He had recognized the imminent lethal danger surrounding my son, and despite facing severe physical retaliation, he had bravely attempted to warn me. He had risked his fragile life to deliver that frantic coded message about the soil and the clean names. A deep, powerful wave of immense gratitude washed over my soul. That brave old man had provided the crucial spark that ultimately saved my life. I immediately made a firm, unbreakable vow. First thing Monday morning, I would personally contact the hospital administration. I would anonymously pay every single cent of his mounting medical bills, ensuring he received the absolute best care available without carrying any financial burden whatsoever. The long, chaotic night eventually surrendered to the quiet, peaceful dawn. The harsh glare of the federal tactical floodlights was finally replaced by the soft, warm glow of the rising morning sun. I walked out onto my wide front porch, holding a steaming ceramic mug of strong black coffee. The crisp, clean autumn air filled my lungs, tasting sweeter and fresher than it had in months. The heavy, suffocating shadow of my son's terrible betrayal had been permanently lifted from my tired shoulders. The quiet suburban street was now a scene of orderly, satisfying justice. I stood silently on the wooden steps, wrapping both hands around the hot mug, watching two massive, heavy-duty tow trucks slowly back into my driveway. The federal agents had swiftly finalized their asset seizure protocols. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter coffee, watching the thick steel chains hook securely onto the front axles of Brad's pristine black SUV and Sarah's flashy imported sedan. The powerful hydraulic winches whined loudly, dragging the expensive, ill-gotten luxury vehicles up onto the flatbed trailers. They were hauling away the hollow, fabricated symbols of a corrupt empire built entirely on lies and stolen money. I watched the trucks rumble down the street, disappearing around the corner, taking the last toxic remnants of my past away forever. My home was quiet, my honor was intact, and my foundation remained absolutely unbroken. I took a deep breath of the morning breeze, turned the handle, and walked inside. 6 months have passed since that freezing autumn night when the flashing lights of the federal cruisers illuminated the darkest chapter of my life. The swift and absolute justice that followed was a direct testament to the irrefutable power of the pristine digital ledgers I had handed over. The federal courts moved with a terrifying, undeniable efficiency. Brad and Sarah were systematically stripped of their arrogant illusions and their stolen wealth. Faced with the staggering mountain of digital evidence and their own recorded confessions, their high-priced defense attorneys had absolutely nothing to negotiate with. The trial was incredibly brief, a sterile and clinical dismantling of their elaborate criminal enterprise. I sat in the front row of the courtroom, watching with a calm, analytical detachment as the prosecuting attorneys presented the ironclad evidence. Brad refused to look in my direction. His shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, while Sarah openly wept as her luxurious future dissolved into the grim reality of a concrete cell. The presiding federal judge showed absolutely no mercy to a son who had meticulously plotted to destroy his own father for financial gain. Brad and Sarah were both officially sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the slightest possibility of parole. They will spend the next decade and a half locked in cold steel cells, completely isolated from the luxurious lifestyle they had treacherously attempted to steal. The massive overseas syndicate they served was entirely dismantled, their domestic operations completely shattered by the cascading federal indictments triggered by those unedited hard drives. The violent men who had carelessly treated my quiet property as a dumping ground for their dark secrets were now facing the harsh, inescapable reality of lifetime sentences. My property, once tainted by their malicious greed, was quickly and legally restored to my name. The complex federal injunctions rapidly nullified the fraudulent corporate deed Brad had so confidently orchestrated. However, walking through those empty, echoing rooms, I realized that the house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a lingering physical monument to a profound betrayal. The polished granite countertops and the heavy oak bookshelves no longer held the warmth of family memories. They only reflected the cold, calculated deception of the two people I had foolishly trusted. I made a swift, unyielding decision to completely sever my remaining ties to that tainted history. I placed the sprawling suburban property on the competitive real estate market, and it sold for a substantial profit within a matter of days. I packed only the genuine, untainted memories, leaving the heavy, suffocating shadows behind forever. I downsized my life, purchasing a comfortable, highly modernized condominium situated directly on the tranquil shores of a pristine, heavily wooded lake just outside the city limits. It is a peaceful, beautiful residence filled with abundant natural light and absolute quiet. There are no forged documents hidden behind the walls and no dark secrets buried in the soil. I wake up every morning to the gentle sound of water lapping against the wooden docks, completely free from the toxic anxiety that had previously consumed my days. The significant financial windfall from the rapid sale of the large house presented me with a unique, powerful opportunity. I vividly remembered the deep, paralyzing fear I had experienced when Brad calmly detailed his flawless plan to permanently institutionalize me. The terrifying reality that a greedy child could so easily manipulate the legal system to declare an elderly parent mentally incompetent and strip them of their fundamental human rights haunted my waking thoughts. I knew with absolute certainty that I was incredibly fortunate to possess the sharp intellect, the technological resources, and the loyal allies required to aggressively fight back. Many aging parents do not have those crucial advantages. They are left completely defenseless, utterly crushed by the sudden, heartbreaking betrayal of their own blood. I decided to actively transform my profound pain into a powerful protective shield for others. I utilized the entirety of the substantial profits from the real estate sale to officially establish a comprehensive legal defense fund. The foundation is specifically designed and heavily funded to aggressively protect vulnerable elderly individuals who are actively facing predatory financial abuse and the terrifying threat of forced non-consensual guardianship. We employ a dedicated team of aggressive, highly specialized attorneys and diligent financial forensic investigators who relentlessly pursue greedy relatives and corrupt caretakers. I spend my mornings actively reviewing complex case files using my decades of analytical engineering experience to meticulously dismantle the carefully constructed lies of abusive family members. We build incredibly strong, uncrackable legal foundations for the victims, ensuring that no arrogant opportunist can ever steal their dignity or their hard-earned legacy. The profound, lingering sadness of losing my son is now completely overshadowed by the incredible, fulfilling purpose of actively saving others from his exact brand of quiet, insidious cruelty. Every time we successfully reverse a fraudulent power of attorney, I feel a profound sense of vindication. This afternoon, the warm golden sun reflects brightly off the gentle ripples of the clear lake. I am sitting comfortably in a small, sturdy aluminum fishing boat, the gentle rocking motion providing a deeply soothing rhythm to the quiet day. Richard sits casually at the opposite end of the small vessel, expertly casting his bright green fishing lure toward a cluster of submerged reeds near the rocky shoreline. We do not speak very much, entirely content to share the profound, comfortable silence that only exists between two men who have successfully navigated a dark, treacherous storm together. He is a steadfast, loyal friend, the kind of rare, genuine companion who stands firmly by your side when the absolute worst of humanity arrives at your front door. I take a slow, deep breath of the crisp, clean air, letting the peaceful atmosphere completely wash over my relaxed shoulders. The beautiful natural landscape surrounding the serene lake stands in stark, magnificent contrast to the concrete walls and the rigid steel bars that currently confine my treacherous son. I close my eyes for a brief, fleeting moment, listening intently to the distant melodic call of a solitary loon echoing across the vast expanse of the shimmering water. I look down at my hands resting easily on the grip of my fishing rod. They are weathered and lined with age, bearing the scars of a long, demanding life. As I watch them hold the heavy rod, I clearly see that they are perfectly steady. They do not shake with fear, and they do not tremble with regret. They are the strong hands of an experienced structural engineer who knew exactly how to dismantle a toxic structure before it could crush him. I survived the devastating betrayal by relying entirely on my patient intellect, my unwavering discipline, and my refusal to become a helpless victim. I patiently allowed my enemies to blindly dig their deep graves, and I steadily dropped the heavy bridge directly on top of their arrogant heads, as the bright sun slowly dips below the tall pines lining the horizon, casting long shadows across the calm water. A quiet smile touches my face. The dark chapter of my life is officially closed. I realize with joyful certainty that my life is far from over. Never mistake the quiet demeanor of an elderly parent for ignorance or weakness. A lifetime of experience, struggle, and survival forges a mind far sharper than any arrogant opportunist could ever anticipate. When greed blinds a person to the point of betraying their own blood, they lose the ability to see the traps they are walking into. True strength does not lie in manipulation or stolen wealth. It lies in integrity, patience, and the courage to demand justice, even when the person you must destroy is the one you once loved. Honor your elders or prepare to face their wisdom. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Have you ever caught someone plotting behind your back? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. Stay sharp, stay strong, and I will see you soon.